Hello and welcome back to State of the Division. This time we're bringing you UFC 292. A actually interesting card with I think some good potential on the early prelims, decent fights on the prelims, and then some prove-it fights I feel like on the main card, as well as the two title fights that both should be pretty interesting and are going to tell us a lot about the future state of several divisions. Coming into this card, we're coming off a pretty decent last card. A lot of things happened, a lot of fights went down, and Derek Lewis flying knees are the thing of beauty that we needed. Man got an 8-fight contract off that, so he did something right. That being said, I'm more so ready to just jump in and kind of start talking about this. But first, so let's get on with the Butcher's Bill. Cody Garbrandt, Henry Cejudo, and Jeff Neal were all supposed to be fighting on this card. All three of them pulled out. That's a lot of name power that just tumbles off the cliff. Thankfully, those three fights have been replaced. However, there is still one fighter who I will mention when we get there who does not yet have a fight in place. That might change during the week, and if we do, I'll throw a ramshot thing together and slot in the middle of this, but as it stands at the time of recording, there is no fight for him. Jeff Neal was supposed to fight Ian Gary. Ian Gary now fights Neil Magny. They at least kept Neil in the name somewhere. Henry Cejudo was supposed to fight Marlon Chito Vera. Vera now faces Pedro Munoz. And Batista was supposed to fight Cody Garbrandt. Cody Garbrandt pulled out. Batista now fights Damon Blackshear on a very quick turnaround off a twister submission. I believe it's the third twister submission in UFC history. That being said, let's jump right into the early prelims. I don't want to talk about my record because mostly I lost a piece of paper I had it written down on. Opening up the early prelims, 11-4, Marina, the Iron Lady Moros, looks for the rebound win against 16-4, Karine Killer Silva. Silva is 2 years younger, 2 or 3 inches shorter, with dead even reach across the board. Moros has been in the UFC since 2015 and has been relatively streaky, stringing together a series of wins followed by a loss or two. Now, overall, she does roll with a 4.19 to 4.36 in striking, and which speaks to her functional striking. And while there are a few fights where she takes these commanding striking leads, a majority of her fights rely on her actual strength, the ground and takedown game. Does only have a .69 takedown average, but looking at her wins, it is a consistent element in those wins. On that note, her takedown defense is only 47%, which either speaks to the ability to play off the back, or is a bit weighted against her with older fights, since she hasn't been taken down since 2018. 4 fights ago. Additionally, there is a sneaky submission game that occasionally rears its head, though I can't call it a consistent threat. Now, Silva is a relative newcomer with 2 official UFC fights and a Contender Series win. Striking sits about the same level, 239 to 343, and had her last TKO, at least strike-wise, in 2019. Her definite strength is the ground game with a 2.24 takedown average and an always present and looming submission game, especially with 7 career submission wins and 3 straight so far in the UFC. She also seems fine with playing off the back or off of her opponent's takedown, switching positions and taking control of it. Silva is the favorite, and I'm going to agree. Nothing against Mariana here, but Silva's more so oppressive takedowns, and Mariana's, she might have improved her takedown defense, she might have an improved takedown game. As it stands now, I don't quite see that, so I feel like she might be able to get taken down this fight, which gives Silva's the edge and lets her take control. So in the end, going to go with Silva here. 13-7, Andrea KGB Lee from the US looks for the rebound against 15-5-1 Natalia Silva. Silva is 8 years younger, 1 or 2 inches shorter, with a whopping 4 inches of reach, heading KGB's way. Now Lee is a bit of an odd case, and that's besides the ring name, and I had an issue getting a read on her. Stat-wise, she rolls with a 5.13 to a 5.359 in striking, with some degree of lurking finish power, only 3 career finishes. She often takes a striking lead of some sort, but in her wins, she takes these dominant striking leads, and I'm talking 20 or more strikes ahead of their opponent. Backing all this up is a pretty solid 2.04 takedown average with a submission game that just hasn't come into play in the UFC. Now, with a takedown, she doesn't always need the lead to win, but on the same hand, she has lost several decisions with the takedown's lead. Joanne Wood, Macy Barber specifically, fill that role. Silva, the other one, with a smaller sample size, steps up with a 5.47 to 1.90 in striking, though she only exceeded 50 strikes in 1 fight so far and has very much pulled on finishing power with striking in her other 2. She has also a looming ground game that also hasn't shown up much in the UFC so far. 1.02 average and 92% defense with 7 career submission wins outside the UFC. Not completely sure how often we will see it, but I can tell you it definitely exists. Now, favorite is Silva. Again, I'm partially convinced Vegas just forgot to type in the names right. And once again, I'm going to agree. Lee doesn't impress me too much on the ground. Yeah, she has a 2.04 takedown average, but Silva here also seems to want to be on the ground in any way she wants. The 92% defense also means that she can control when she goes to the ground. And given that she doesn't have as much as a sample size, I feel like there's more time to see if that takedown game comes into play quicker than we have with Lee so far. 9-1, Andrei Petroski looks to keep rolling against the 35-16, Gerald GM3 Mearshart. Petroski is 3 years younger, 1 inch shorter, but 4 inches in reach are going to GM3. Petroski is a finisher and a dangerous one at that. 4 KO and 4 submission wins in his pro career, proving that fully. His striking sits as a 364 to 228, and I feel like the real danger of it is the power that he can bring out, and not so much the variety or quality of the strikes he can throw. However, the more dangerous part of his game, as with a few of these fighters, is the takedown and ground game. A 5.43 takedown average, and the ability to stack them almost at will. In all but one of his UFC fights, he landed 4 more takedowns, and the one he didn't, he won by anaconda choke, because that makes sense. It is worth noting that he is capable of dominating the top and controlling the ground like a true grinder. GM3, because I'm not saying that last name, comes into this fight with a 3-1-1, 3-4-7 in striking, which is pretty basic for a wrestler like him. The only big thing I noticed was that he has been caught on the feet before and put away. So it seems like his toughness can be surpassed, or he can be stifled quickly before getting the ground going, which is the main part of his game. Runs with a 2.12 takedown average and continuous submission threat. I mean, all of his last 4 wins were by rear naked choke. He doesn't really get much control time, instead getting the takedown and going for the submission. It is worth noting that he likes to control the takedown, and when he gets taken down, he has seemed to struggle a bit in the past, although that could be a matchup thing. Vegas likes Petroski, and I was honestly torn writing this. In the end, I am going to be boring and agree. I think Petroski has more going for him right now, and I think given that GM3 has struggled with takedown-focused fighters before, I don't think this goes in his favor. However, I struggled because I have a weird preference for GM3 as a fighter, and I don't know why, but also this feels like a fight that he can win and shockingly might catch Petroski on the feet if Petroski's going to be focused on that ground game. I don't know, it just feels like a weird fight going into it. I'm picking Petroski to win, but I have a weird feeling about GM3 here. Well, here it is. The last-minute dreaded replacement fight, especially at the time of recording this. As such, you have this little ramshot thing thrown together, but Brad Katona now fights Cody Gibson instead of his original opponent. At least he gets a fight on the card. Coming around to the numbers and stats and that sort of thing, Katona much more is a grinder, not coming off a wins in the UFC and likely fighting for a contract here, or not to get cut. Katona is the grinder here. His striking is okay, lets him hang in. His ground game is okay, 22% takedown accuracy. He's not great. He hasn't been fighting great in the UFC. He's that grinding style that isn't exciting. He kind of just been getting beat in most of his fights in the UFC so far. Cody Gibson also left the UFC without a win, but he is coming off a win in the the up-and-coming fighting championship or whatever it's called. More so, he seems to be the striker. He has 7 career KO wins and 8 career decision wins, which is a little odd considering that spread, but he seems to like to hang on the feet, and if he does grind, it's in the striking, but he does appear to have knockout power in there somewhere. He is 35, and he is taking this fight on short notice, which, given the quality of what Katona looks to be, I'm not sure how much that matters in this fight. And no offense to Katona, he's a UFC fighter, but his record isn't great and he hasn't looked great so far in the UFC. In the end, Vegas narrowly favors Katona. It's not hard to see why. He was in a camp. But I'm going to go against it. I'm going to pick Gibson here. Mostly because I went with Vegas for most of everything else, and I really feel like Gibson is a real solid shot to win, and he's a weird opponent for somebody like Katona to go against, especially because I don't trust Katona's takedowns too much, and Gibson wants to be on the feet. Returning UFC newcomer, 15-6, Austin Thud Hubbard looks to start a career comeback against the returning 19-7-0-1 Kurt Holobaugh. Hubbard is 5 years younger, 1 inch shorter, with 1 inch in reach coming back his way. Old Mother Hubbard here last fought for the UFC in 2021 with a loss to Vink Pichel before ending up in ex-MMA and Caged Aggression in 2022. Overall, he has been more so a grinder, getting the fight to the end and winning by decision. 8 of his career wins coming that way. Now, pulling from his UFC stats page, he rocks a 3.67 to 2.97 striking, which is just solid and good enough to let him hang in against most opponents. He also runs with a 1.35 takedown average, which gets used to generate chunks of ground control time and recovery. However, he can be beat on the ground and limited in his ability to control. He was 4-0 on takedowns against Pichel, but both had nearly the same ground control time. Holloway has a remarkably similar story. Last fought for the UFC in 2019 before heading over to XFC in 2020 and 2021. Unlike Hubbard, he more so lives by the ability to finish and had no real UFC success, 6 fights with 5 losses and 1 no contest. He has 7 KO and 9 submission wins, which speaks to an aggressive and decently rounded game, but on the flip side, he carries 5 decision losses. So in an odd way, he relies on the ability to finish fights to prevent his opponents from taking him to later rounds and racking up points through totals. Now, Vegas likes Hubbard, and I will agree. Old Mother Holloway is dangerous and could win given that he is a finisher, but Old Mother Hubbard is that more rounded style, tends to be the grinder, tends to go to later rounds, all things that you see Holloway struggle with. Obviously, finishers can win the fight in any round, but you've seen with Hubbard that he likes going to those later rounds more. His game plan is to get to those later rounds. Holloway's going to try to finish early. If he doesn't get it, we're going to later rounds. That's where Hubbard's power set is. 13-5, Gregory Robocop Rodriguez looks for the rebound against 10-7-0-1 Dennis Tiulilian. Rodriguez is 4 years younger, 2 inches taller, but 2 inches in reach do go to Dennis. Rodriguez leans into finishing power as his main threat, with 8 career KO wins and 3 of those in the UFC. Numbers back that up as he runs with a 6.09 to 5.82 in striking and the obvious threat of the lurking power. Now, with that, he can wade into firefights and get beat at his own game, or in the odd case, he is unable to match the output of his opponents. Backing all that up is a decently solid takedown game that he makes use of as an opportunistic attack and way to disrupt his opponent's timing. Dennis has a much smaller sample size in the UFC, but outside the UFC, he presents as a striking-focused KO artist. Leans into the power as the be-all, end-all. He has 0 submission wins but 4 losses, which makes him believe the ground is not a strength of his, and likely he will want to stay off of it. Vegas likes Rodriguez, and being boring, I will once again agree. Rodriguez has done more overall, and the presence of a disruptive takedown game and some slight effectiveness there gives him the edge in my mind over someone who desperately wants to stay off the ground and has a lot of submission losses. I don't think it'll end by submission, but I think he'll be able to generate more time, more control, more points off of a takedown than Thielen will be able to generate striking points off him. I believe we're on to the main card, but with canceled fights, the UFC list got all jacked up. 15-6, Chris All-American Weidman makes his return to the octagon against 19-8, Brad Tavares. Tavares is 4 years younger at 35. However, Weidman either is 1 or 4 inches taller because they can't agree, but a definite 4 going their way in reach. Weidman's been in the UFC since 2011 and has had a storied career that got a little streaky as of 2015, plus a darkly ironic leg injury in 2021. Aside from that, he comes across as a wrestler who controls his opponents on the ground. Striking-wise, he has a functional 303 to 314 and some sneaky KO power that can come out of nowhere if he can nail his shot. This is very much not Oliveira-esque, but he has that Oliveira ability of he knocks you out with perfect timing, not so much overwhelming power. When it comes to the takedowns, which is his main thing, he rolls with a 3.92 average and a 65% defense where he controls when they go to the ground, most of the time. He does have submission ability, which seems a little inconsistent, but it's a looming threat that one has to look out for. Tavares tends to hang on the feet a little more. He's a 332 to 306 in striking, but in the UFC, he hasn't really had consistent knockout power. Overall, it's been that grinding, point-based striking, relying on pressure and matching the output of his opponents to point them to the end. Does only have a 0.85 takedown average, but 80% takedown defense tells you where he tries to keep this fight, and he doesn't want to go to the ground with it. Vegas likes Tavares, and for the first time, I'm disagreeing on this card. Let's ignore the fact it's blatant favoritism and nostalgia, and instead we're going to take a look at the idea that I think Weidman's ground game is going to be a threat to Tavares. And if Tavares can't keep him on the feet, I think Weidman's going to be able to control the ground really well in the 3-round fight to get the time, points, and whatever he needs to take it to the end. 28-1, Marlon Chito Vera looks to right the ship against 27-0-2, Pedro Young Punisher Munoz. Vera is 6 years younger at 30, 2 inches taller, while also taking 2 inches in reach. Vera is another odd fighter numbers-wise. Overall, I describe him as a striking-focused finisher with the ability to play off the back if need be. Numbers-wise, rocks a 409 to 502 in striking, which definitely highlights the power he's able to pull on throughout the entire fight, even if he is being beaten in strikes. Looking at the Rob Font fight, he had 159 strikes to Font's 271, but had 3 knockdowns in 2 minutes and 5 seconds of ground control. In that same vein, he has pulled out late round KOs in fights that were either close or going the other way at that moment. Ground game is hard to talk about it, and by that I mean he has a submission ability. He can capitalize on knockdowns or even play off the back sometimes, but there are fights where his ground game just disappears and is completely neutralized. And as a whole, I feel it's good, but it's something that can be locked away or put away by better ground fighters that puts him on the back foot. Munoz is a late replacement. As I said, I believe he was supposed to fight Henry Cejudo initially. He hasn't really... Now, Munoz late replacement, though I'm not sure how late. Carries a 5.30 to 5.90 in striking, which speaks to his style of stepping into that phone booth against anyone and everyone. I'm pretty sure he'd do it with a silverback. Hasn't really had the KO touch all that recently, 2019 being his last KO win, but he has kept the striking pace high and stayed in the fight against most of his opponents as that grinder, laying on the pressure, laying on the damage, and just keeping fights going. He doesn't really have a takedown game, a whopping .51 average and not really all that present. I mean, his last takedown was in 2018, but there is an 81% takedown defense, which means he's decently good at keeping it on the feet where he wants to be. Vegas likes Vera by a narrow margin, and this is another fight that was weirdly agonizing for me to choose. In the end, I agree. I think the striking-wise, the power that Vera has found recently and has been pulling on gives him the edge, and the odd takedown game I still don't know how I feel about is something that Munoz is going to have to be wary about. But it feels bad to count Munoz out of this fight if you're being honest. His striking pace is always high, he's been able to match, and he's still got durability. I don't know if Vera's able to put him away or if they'll just match in striking, but Munoz should be dangerous in this fight, and I think it'll be closer than it is. Obviously, being a late replacement kind of tilts the odds, but in the end, I still feel like this is a pretty close fight. On to another replacement fight. 12-2, Mario Batista tries to keep the streak rolling against the week of replacement, 14-5-1, Damon Da Monster Blackshear. Ironically, that ring name is growing on me. Blackshear is 1 year younger, 1 inch taller, with 3 inches in reach, also going his way. Now, it is important to note that Batista was training for a different opponent completely before that fight fell apart, and Blackshear stepped in this week to fill in. Now, Batista is a finisher with a heavy focus on the ground and submissions. In that vein, he rolls with a 2.91 takedown average and a tendency to stack them in quick succession or capitalize on the first attempt to get the finish. And in his most recent fights, he has definitely leaned more heavily into that ground game over the striking, rocking a 5.33 to 3.73, but that seems inflated by 3 separate performances where he blew his opponent out of the water. It does not seem like every fight follows that trend of striking. In his other fights, the non-outliers, he tends to hang close together and uses the ground game to equalize the difference. Blackshear, on a very quick turnaround, looking to be the first fighter in a non-tournament fight to win 2 fights in 1 week, is also a ground-focused finisher with 9 career submission wins. Carries a 3.68 to 3.68 in striking, which is odd, and that sums up his success striking in the UFC so far. Buck average. Now, the focus of his game obviously is the ground, and he has been able to survive being taken down and being out of position, which gets him through tricky positions. Again, with only 3 real fights in the UFC, I'm not quite sure of how livid and active his takedown game is, but Vegas likes Batista. I'm going to agree because he's been in camp longer. Blackshear coming off a fight, he'll be in shape. I assume he'll make weight. But I feel like Blackshear's coming in against someone who's been training, been in camp, and I'm not sure how different the game plan is going to be. Plus, I feel that his striking will likely be able to outpace Blackshear if they both decide to try to stay on the feet for it. And another replacement fight. 28-10, Neil, the Haitian sensation. Magny steps in for Jeff Neal against 12-0, Ian, the future, Gary. Gary is 11 years younger, Jesus, even height, but 6 inches in reach, going Magny's way, Jesus. Magny is a decently well-rounded grinder who brings the ability to go anywhere in the octagon into this fight. He carries a 3.52 to a 2.25 in striking, which is just good enough to let him hang in or take a solid striking lead in some fights, though not in significant strikes, just kind of an overall striking lead, which is an interesting that you don't see that often. It is worth noting that knockout power really isn't there, but on the flip side, he doesn't really get KO'd all that often. Takedown game is solid, a 2.30, and constant presence in most of his fights, plus the ability to reverse positions, capitalize on mistakes, and gain ground control time. Ian Gary comes in with a 6.85 to 4.09 in striking, solid finishing ability, and consistent ability to carry pace into later rounds. In terms of finishing, 3 of his 5 UFC fights have all been finishes, but as a whole he has 7 career KO wins. In terms of takedowns, he carries a .29 with a 63% defense, which Isn't a great average, decent defense though, so you know he wants to stay on the feet for the duration of his fights. He has proven the ability to minimize damage and get back to the feet in fights where he's taken down. Vegas likes Gary, and on short notice, I will disagree here. Gary has a great chance of winning, but Magny is disruptive to a point, and the way he fights is deal damage, put you against the cage, put you on the ground, and just grind you. Maybe Gary wins, but I think Magny's the type of fighter that's going to cause an issue for Gary throughout the entire fight. So in the end, I'm going to go against Vegas. I'm going to pick Magny. Now for the co-main event. 23-3, Weili Magnum Zhang looks to retain against the challenger. 13-2-1, Amanda Hina Lemos. Zhang is 2 years younger at 34 with even height, but 2 inches in reach, rolling Lemos' way. Zhang comes in with a pretty rounded fight game with finishability in every aspect. 11 career KO and 8 career submission wins. Now, she does have some preference for the striking, a 5.79 to 406 totals there, and a lot of times she takes these striking leads and maintains them over the length of the bout. Additionally, she has a variety of strikes at her disposal, which she uses to manage distance and catch her opponents off guard. Takedown game adds another wrinkle with 1.97 average and the ability to play off other fighters' attempts or mistakes. Basically, she doesn't necessarily need a takedown to get control time or take position. Lemos is relatively similar in terms of numbers, but style-wise feels a bit more kill or be killed. 7 of her 9 UFC fights ending by finish, 5 of them being wins. She runs with a 4.51 to 3.97 in striking, and seems to have a little less of a pure variety, but brings a bit more power behind her, at least in the UFC. I will say that fighters are able to stay close in terms of striking, but her power serves as the equalizer. Rolling onto the ground game, she carries a 1.12 average for the takedown, and honestly doesn't really tend to stack them. Instead, she runs with a one-and-done kind of approach to takedowns. However, she does capitalize on mistakes and preventing herself from being on the ground too long in positions she doesn't want to be. Vegas likes Zhang, and against my better judgment, because I know how good of a fighter she is, having picked against her I think twice before, I'm going to go Lemos. In short, Lemos seems to at least be able to hang in with Zhang looking at the paper and looking at the numbers. I think the ability to play out of position makes her a little more dangerous than Zhang, being able to play off the back, being that one-and-done takedown, constantly pushing that finish, compared to Zhang's more controlled, methodical grinding, and if the finish is open, it's because she grounds you to dust to get there. Now for the main event. 23-3, Aljamain Funkmaster Sterling looks to keep his title against 16-1-0-1, Sugar Sean O'Malley. O'Malley is 6 years younger, 4 inches taller, only a single inch of reach going his way though, which is a little odd. Sterling is best described as a grinder, and I mean that as nicely as possible. Striking is a nice 4.78 to 2.37, and he works his reach very well to control pace and keep himself out of immediate danger. I will say he never really pulls KO power out with his striking, instead racking up points and some noticeable damage. His real strength is the takedown and control time game. He's a 2.02 takedown average and decent submission threat, but I feel that his ability to backpack an opponent on the ground is one of his greatest strengths, because it forces them to be active and allows them to have a variety of attempts and just rack up control time for the scorecard. And speaking of control time, that's what he does. He controls you on the ground and can grind you to a finish. Yes, he can swing and bang. Yes, he can fight on the feet with a fair amount of fighters. But the best part of his game, I feel, is the takedowns. Him striking, while he's good, it's not his greatest strength. He wants to go to the ground. He wants to get that control time. Now, O'Malley could not be farther from that. Rocks a 7.43 to a 3.54 in striking, and a definite KO ability waiting in the wings there. Do feel that a majority of his KO wins come from the swarming nature of his striking, but the ability to land shots that rock your opponents are still good. I will say I don't feel that he has the greatest variety of strikes, but his toolbox is loaded with dangerous weapons. That's a dumb way of saying basically he's lethal with what he's got. My biggest question comes with his takedown game, a whopping 0.45, and the fact he doesn't really want to go to the ground. 60% takedown defense helps with that, but I also don't feel he's faced an amazing ground-focused fighter yet. Technically, Peter Yan took him down 6 times, but that felt more so like trips and throws, and Yan didn't really do much off of that. Against a fighter like Sterling, this is the real test. Vegas likes Sterling, and while O'Malley is a hell of a striker and has proven a lot of my main criticisms of him wrong, I'm still going to go with Sterling. I think if Sean can keep it on the feet and keep Sterling from getting to where he wants to be on that ground, I think Sterling's in a bad way. But I feel like Sterling's going to shoot takedowns, pin against the cage, go for control time, and sort of put Sean where Sean doesn't want to be. I know he said things about this camp being different. It's been more of a wrestling camp and things like that. Sterling's a very good wrestler. I'm willing to pick him in this fight because I think he has a chance of winning it. Well, that being said, that's UFC 292 in a very rough nutshell. I think this is a fun card. I think there's some really good questions being asked. We're seeing tests of skill for some up-and-coming or fighters who are already at the top. Ian Gary, Sean O'Malley. These are pretty big tests for both of them. If Marlon Chito Vera puts on a great performance and wins against Munoz, I think we see his name maybe in a title shot, seeing the resolution of this one. I think he might need another win, though. I wish there were some heavyweights on this card, but you can't win everything. Overall, I'm excited to see how this card goes. I'm excited for the results. But in the end, that's UFC 292. Go ahead and leave your opinions down below. Thank you for watching, and have a good fight.